The child in the nursery was never sleeping. He was a masterpiece of moral decay, a shell of beeswax and stolen hair designed to protect a bloodline that had already ended. In the winter of 1874, the most powerful dynasty in the county did not lose their heir. They simply refused to let him die. For 20 years, a hollow effigy with clockwork lungs and glass eyes occupied a silk-lined cradle, while a massive fortune was siphoned in the name of a ghost. This was the clandestine art of the Mourning Doll, a secret so dark it required the total silence of an entire estate. The servants were paid in gold to feed a mouth that never opened, and the doctors were threatened into signing health certificates for a patient who had no pulse. It was a betrayal of the natural order, a curse of greed that turned a home into a mausoleum. You have been told that the Victorians were obsessed with the beauty of death, but the truth is far more forbidden. They were obsessed with the power that death could not take away. Behind the velvet curtains of the manor, a lie was breathing. Powered by gears and the desperation of a family who feared poverty more than they feared God, this is the truth the dynasty buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the cold fog of London pressing against the window panes, and the distant sound of a carriage slowing to a halt on a gravel path. The world outside is fading, leaving only the soft glow of a dying fire and the rhythmic, hypnotic pull of a story long forgotten. Breathe deeply, and let the shadows of the past guide you into the stillness of the night. The carriage door opened with a heavy, metallic click that echoed through the silent courtyard of Blackwood Manor. Miss Elspeth Thorne stepped onto the damp earth, her black wool cloak heavy with the mist of the English countryside. She was a woman of precise habits and quiet nerves, hired to serve as the new governess for the young Master Julian. The letter of employment had been brief, written on thick, cream-colored stationery with a seal that bore the crest of a rising sun. The wages offered were triple the standard rate, a detail that should have served as a warning rather than an invitation. As she looked up at the towering gray stone of the house, she noticed that every single window was draped in heavy, dark fabric. Not a single sliver of candlelight escaped the interior. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for a heartbeat that would never come. The heavy oak doors were opened by a butler whose face was as pale and expressionless as the stone walls behind him. He did not speak, he simply gestured for her to enter. The air inside the foyer was thick with the scent of beeswax, stale lavender, and something sharper, something chemical that bit at the back of the throat. Elspeth felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. The grand staircase spiraled upward into a darkness that the dim wall sconces could not reach. Above her, she heard a faint, rhythmic clicking sound. It was steady, mechanical, and entirely out of place in a home of such ancient opulence. It sounded like the ticking of a grandfather clock, yet it possessed a wet, labored quality, like the sighing of a bellows in a blacksmith's forge. As she was led toward the upper floors, Elspeth observed the peculiar details of the household. There were no mirrors in the hallways. Every reflective surface had been covered with black crepe, a tradition usually reserved for the immediate days following a death. Yet the letter had explicitly stated that her charge, Master Julian, was a vibrant though delicate young boy of 5 years. At the 500-word mark of her journey into the house, she recalled the historical weight of the Victorian Code of Inheritance. Under the strict laws of the time, many estates were bound by the rule against perpetuities and complex entails. If a direct male heir was not present and living to reach his 21st year, the entire fortune, the lands, and the titles would bypass the immediate family and revert to a distant, estranged cousin who was known for his gambling debts and malice. This financial pressure created a culture of desperation where the line between life and death became a matter of accounting. They reached the heavy door of the nursery at the end of the north wing. The butler stopped and turned to her, his eyes fixed on a point just above her shoulder. He whispered that the mistress requested absolute silence as the child was in a state of perpetual rest. He handed her a small silver key and withdrew into the shadows of the corridor without another word. Elspeth stood alone, the key cold in her hand. The clicking sound from within the room grew louder, a rhythmic wheeze that seemed to vibrate through the wood of the door. She turned the lock and pushed it open. The nursery was a cavern of blue velvet and golden embroidery. Dozens of candles burned in tall silver candelabras, their flames steady in the stagnant air. In the center of the room sat a massive, ornate cradle carved from dark mahogany. Beside it sat the mistress of the house, Lady Catherine, draped in the heavy weeds of a widow, though her husband was known to be traveling abroad. She did not look up. Her hands were busy adjusting a lace collar on the figure within the cradle. Elspeth approached with soft steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she finally looked down, she saw the heir. Master Julian lay perfectly still. His skin had a translucent, pearly quality that caught the candlelight in a way that human flesh never could. His golden hair was thick and lustrous, but it did not seem to grow from his scalp. It seemed to be embedded into it, strand by individual strand. His chest rose and fell with a mechanical precision that was too perfect to be natural. Click, hiss, click, hiss. The sound was coming from a small brass vent hidden beneath the silk pillows. Elspeth reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the child's cheek. It was cold. It was hard. It was the unmistakable texture of expensive, polished wax. Lady Catherine's hand, cold as the marble of a tombstone, clamped around Elspeth's wrist before her fingers could retreat from the waxy cheek. The woman's grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by a frantic, nervous energy that seemed to vibrate through her black lace sleeves. She did not look angry. Instead, her eyes were wide, pleading, and glazed with a thin film of tears that never actually fell. She whispered that the boy was very sensitive to the touch, and that the oils from a common hand could agitate his delicate condition. Elspeth felt the breath leave her lungs. She looked from the mother's desperate face back to the occupant of the cradle. Up close, the illusion was both magnificent and terrifying. The eyelashes were real, likely harvested from a pauper's child or perhaps the original Julian himself, and they cast long, flickering shadows against the cheekbones as the candles danced. Lady Catherine began to speak in a low, rhythmic drone, explaining that Julian had been struck by a rare pulmonary affliction during the Great Fog of 1873. She claimed the doctors had prescribed a regime of absolute stillness and a mechanical respirator to assist his breathing. It was a story so practiced, so meticulously crafted, that for a moment Elspeth almost allowed herself to believe it. But the evidence of the senses was undeniable. There was no warmth radiating from the small body. There was no scent of a living child, no trace of soap or milk or sweat. Instead, the air around the cradle was heavy with the smell of turpentine and arsenic, chemicals used by taxidermists to prevent decay, and by doll makers to stabilize the finish of high-grade paraffin. In the year 1874, the creation of such a masterpiece was a feat of dark engineering. While the common people visited Madame Tussauds to gawp at the likenesses of criminals, the aristocracy had access to a much more private and expensive class of artisan. A full-sized, articulated wax effigy of this quality would have cost upwards of £500, a sum that could purchase an entire row of houses in the East End. This was a historical reality of the era, where the industry of death was as profitable as the industry of life. These artists, often trained in medical schools to create anatomical models, were the only ones capable of mimicking the subtle translucency of skin and the intricate folds of an infant's ear. Elspeth pulled her hand away, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She asked why a governess was needed for a child who could not move or speak. Lady Catherine's smile was a thin, jagged line. She explained that a house of their standing must maintain appearances. There must be lessons read aloud. There must be walks taken in the garden with the carriage. There must be a constant hum of nursery activity to satisfy the curious ears of the staff and the prying eyes of the solicitors who visited once a month to verify the heir's well-being. The estate was a theater, and Elspeth was being hired not as a teacher, but as a lead actress in a play that could never end. As the night deepened, Lady Catherine insisted that Elspeth begin her duties immediately. She was handed a book of poetry and told to read to the cradle while the mistress retired to her chambers. Left alone in the blue velvet silence, Elspeth sat in a low chair. The mechanical wheezing of the doll was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic sigh that seemed to sync with her own breathing. She opened the book, but her eyes kept drifting to the floor. There, tucked half-hidden under the heavy dust ruffle of the cradle, was a small white object. She leaned down and picked it up. It was a child's tooth, complete with a jagged, bloody root. It was fresh. If the occupant of the cradle was made of wax and clockwork, whose tooth was lying on the floor of the nursery? The question hung in the air, a sharp hook of mystery that the silence of the room refused to answer. Elspeth felt the weight of 1,000 secrets pressing down on her. She realized then that the law of perpetual infancy was not just a financial strategy, it was a prison. The historical records of the time show that many families used the chancery courts to lock up fortunes for generations, but the Blackwood family had gone a step further. They had bypassed the courts entirely by pretending that time had simply stopped. As long as Julian remained 5 years old, as long as he remained sick and resting, the gambling cousin in London would never see a single penny of the inheritance. She began to read, her voice trembling as she recited the verses of Tennyson. She spoke to the wax, to the glass eyes that seemed to catch the light and follow her every movement. Every few minutes she had to stop and catch her breath, the chemical fumes from the doll making her head swim. She wondered how many other governesses had sat in this chair. She wondered if they had simply fled into the night, or if they had become part of the house's silent history. The velvet weight of the room seemed to press in on Elspeth as the candle flames burned lower, their wicks drowning in pools of hot tallow. She held the small, blood-stained tooth between her thumb and forefinger, feeling the sharp reality of it against the surreal backdrop of the wax child. If this nursery was a stage for a silent play, the tooth was a piece of the set that had fallen out of place, a fragment of the truth that refused to be polished away. She looked at the cradle, specifically at the area where the mechanical hissing originated. Her curiosity, sharpened by a lifetime of practical survival in the houses of the wealthy, overcame her fear. She knelt on the cold floor, her black skirt pooling around her like a shadow, beneath the intricate mahogany carvings of the cradle's base. She discovered a small rectangular panel held shut by a brass latch. It was hidden behind a decorative flourish representing a cluster of grapes. With a steady hand, she slid the latch. The panel creaked open, revealing a world of polished brass and gleaming steel. Inside was a complex array of gears, springs, and a set of miniature bellows crafted from the finest calfskin. It was a masterpiece of Victorian automata, a testament to the era's fascination with mechanical life. During this period, the finest clockmakers of the Black Forest in Germany were often commissioned by the English aristocracy to create such wonders. From singing birds in gilded cages to writing figurines that could mimic human script. This was the pinnacle of secret engineering, designed to simulate the rhythmic rise and fall of a human chest with such precision that it could fool a casual observer from several feet away. But as Elspeth peered deeper into the clockwork, she noticed something that chilled her more than the cold wax of the child's face. Caught within the teeth of a primary gear was a tangle of dark, matted hair. It was not the golden, soft down that adorned the doll's head. It was coarse, brown, and unmistakably real. There was a faint, lingering scent of iron and rot coming from the mechanism, a smell that the lavender and turpentine had failed to fully mask. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The machine wasn't just imitating life. It was being maintained with pieces of it. She quickly closed the panel as she heard the distant, muffled sound of footsteps in the hallway. The rhythmic thud was heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the metallic clink of keys. It was the butler, returning to check on the nursery. Elspeth scrambled back into her chair, opening the book of Tennyson to a random page. She began to read, her voice a hollow whisper that struggled to find a steady rhythm. She spoke of shadows and the Lady of Shalott, the words blurring before her eyes as the door handle began to turn. The butler entered, his lantern casting long, distorted shadows across the blue velvet walls. He did not look at Elspeth. Instead, he walked directly to the cradle. He produced a small silver oil can from his pocket and began to lubricate the invisible joints of the doll's neck and shoulders. The way he handled the effigy was devoid of any tenderness. It was the movement of a man maintaining a piece of factory equipment. He checked the tension of the silk blankets and adjusted the glass eyes with a specialized tool, ensuring they were perfectly centered. Elspeth watched him, her hand still clutched around the tooth in her pocket. She asked him how long Master Julian had been in this state. The butler paused, his hand hovering over the doll's forehead. He replied that in Blackwood Manor, time was not measured by the sun or the moon, but by the requirements of the bloodline. He told her that the boy was as he needed to be, and that her only concern was to ensure the silence of the North Wing remained unbroken. He mentioned that the previous governess had been dismissed for being too inquisitive about the local census. This was a pointed reference to the Census Act of 1871, which had introduced stricter penalties for falsifying household records. The government was becoming increasingly efficient at tracking the population, making the Blackwood deception infinitely more dangerous with each passing year. Every time a census taker arrived at the gates, a new layer of the lie had to be constructed, a new bribe paid, and a new reason given for why the heir could not be presented in person. The household was a fortress of fraud, and every servant within its walls was a silent conspirator in a crime against the crown. When the butler finally left, he extinguished all but 2 of the candles, plunging the room into a deep amber gloom. Elspeth was left with the wheezing doll and the secret in her pocket. She realized that the tooth did not belong to the wax child. nor did it belong to the original Julian, who had likely died years ago. It belonged to someone else, someone who was currently being used to keep the machinery of the inheritance running. Was there a living child hidden elsewhere in the house? A source for the hair and the teeth that made the Mourning Doll look so disturbingly real? The question gnawed at her as she leaned back in the chair, her eyes growing heavy despite her terror. The rhythmic clicking of the lungs began to sound like a heartbeat, slow and hypnotic. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in the darkness of her mind, she saw a line of wax children, all identical, all breathing with the same mechanical hiss, stretching back through the centuries of the Blackwood lineage. She wondered if the family had ever truly had a living heir, or if the entire history of the estate was nothing more than a series of well-dressed dolls and clever gears the fire in the grate had reduced to a pile of glowing embers, casting a deep crimson hue across the nursery floor that looked disturbingly like spilled wine. Elspeth stood up, her joints stiff from the hours of forced stillness. She knew she should sleep, but the weight of the tooth in her pocket and the matted hair in the gears acted as a stimulant, a sharp needle of truth in a room made of soft velvet lies. She began to pace the perimeter of the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. Every few seconds she would glance back at the cradle, half expecting the wax eyelids to snap open and reveal the void beneath. She stopped in front of a large, gilt-framed oil painting that hung on the north wall. It was a portrait of the Blackwood lineage, a long line of men with high foreheads and narrow, predatory eyes. At the very end of the line was a space left empty, presumably reserved for Julian. As she adjusted the candle she held, the light caught a small, irregular gap in the plaster behind the frame. She reached behind the heavy gold wood and felt a cold draft of air. There was a hidden latch, identical in craftsmanship to the one on the cradle. This was a period in English architectural history when the great houses were built with a dual purpose. On the surface, they were monuments to wealth and stability, but within the walls they were riddled with servant passages and priest holes from a more turbulent age. In 1874, these passages served as the circulatory system of the house, allowing the staff to move unseen and unheard, maintaining the luxury of the elite without ever disturbing their sightlines. Elspeth pressed the latch, and a section of the wall swung inward with a silent, well-oiled glide. The passage beyond was narrow and smelled of damp earth and old wool. She stepped inside, her candle flame flickering wildly in the sudden current of air. A few feet down the passage, she found a small iron-barred window that looked into a tiny, windowless cell located directly behind the nursery wall. She held her candle to the bars and felt the air leave her lungs. Inside the cell was a small cot. On the cot sat a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with coarse brown hair and a face that was a rough, commoner's version of the Julian doll. He was awake, sitting in the darkness with a vacant, hollow stare. He was missing his front teeth. The horror of the Blackwood secret was finally laid bare in the flickering light of her candle. The law of perpetual infancy required more than just a wax doll. It required a biological source to provide the authentic details that kept the deception alive. This child was the shadow heir, a pauper's son purchased or stolen to act as the silent donor for the effigy's hair, its teeth, and perhaps even its voice when a solicitor needed to hear a muffled cry from behind a closed door. To the Blackwood family, the life of this child was a secondary concern to the preservation of the trust fund. They were harvesting the living to maintain the appearance of the dead. This act of social cannibalism was a dark reflection of the 1874 births and deaths, Registration Act. This legislation had been designed to bring order to the chaotic records of the Victorian era, requiring that all deaths be registered within 5 days and accompanied by a medical certificate. The law was intended to prevent secret burials and the concealment of crime. But for families like the Blackwoods, it only made their crimes more sophisticated. By never registering Julian's death, and by hiding the source child within the very structure of the house, they had created a loophole that the law could not reach. They had turned their home into a legal void where the living were ghosts and the ghosts were legal entities. Elspeth watched the boy for a long time. He did not speak. He did not even look at the light. He had been conditioned into a state of total, soul-crushing silence. He was a piece of the house's inventory, no different from the silver spoons or the velvet curtains. She realized that her role as a governess was not to teach, but to act as a jailer for a secret that spanned 2 worlds. The world of wax and the world of flesh. She slowly closed the hidden door, the click of the latch sounding like the finality of a coffin lid. She returned to her chair by the cradle. The mechanical lungs of the doll hissed. Click, hiss. It was no longer just a sound of machinery. It was the sound of a family's moral rot, a rhythmic reminder of the price paid for a fortune. Elspeth sat in the darkness, the single remaining candle casting her shadow against the wall, making her look like a giant, dark bird of prey watching over a nest of lies. The night was at its deepest point, the hour when the line between reality and nightmare is thinnest. Outside, the fog had completely swallowed the manor, cutting it off from the rest of the world. Within these walls, Julian would never grow old. He would never inherit the madness of his ancestors. He would remain a perfect, waxen 5-year-old forever, while the boy in the wall grew old in the dark. The Blackwood legacy was safe, secured by the silence of the governess and the steady, artificial breath of a doll, but as the first hint of gray light began to touch the edges of the velvet curtains, a new question began to haunt her. If the nursery held a doll made of wax and a boy made of shadows, what did the rest of the estate hold? Was this nursery only the beginning of a much larger factory of deception? The secret of the Mourning Doll was just one thread in a tapestry of erased truths. To find the origin of the masterpiece, she would have to look beyond the manor. Into the soot-stained workshops of the city. The light is growing now, but the mystery is only deepening. The answers do not lie in the nursery, but in the workshops of the midnight taxidermists, where the line between art and atrocity was blurred with the strike of a needle. The doll in the cradle is waiting for its morning dressing, but the secret of its creation is already calling from the shadows of the London underground. If the nursery held a doll made of wax, what did the cellar hold? The answer lies in the workshops of the midnight taxidermists, where the line between art and atrocity was blurred with the strike of a needle dot in the soot-stained labyrinths of Victorian London. A trade existed that was never spoken of in the bright drawing rooms of the elite. Yet it was funded by their deepest fears and most desperate greeds. While the world believed that death was an absolute end, a group of silent artisans known as the Midnight Taxidermists proved that for the right price, a child could be made to live forever in a state of waxen perfection. These were not mere doll makers. They were defectors from the prestigious world of medical science. Men who had spent their lives crafting anatomical models for surgeons only to realize that the grieving aristocracy would pay a king's ransom for a lie they could hold. They took the hair from the cold scalp, the teeth from the silent jaw, and the very breath from a hidden machine to ensure that a family fortune remained intact. It was a forbidden industry born of moral decay, a betrayal of the natural cycle that turned the sanctity of mourning into a mechanical performance. Every strand of hair was a secret kept from the light, every glass eye a witness to a conspiracy that spanned the city's most powerful estates. This was a craft of shadows, a hidden market of bone and beeswax that thrived in the damp cellars of Smithfield and Clockenwell. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the heavy, yellow fog of 1874 rolling off the Thames. A thick blanket of coal smoke and river mist that swallows the gaslights and turns the city into a ghostly maze. The sounds of the modern world are fading, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of water in a narrow alleyway and the distant, muffled ring of a church bell. Breathe deeply and let the cold, damp air of old London settle around you as we descend into the hidden world of the silent artisans. To understand the origin of the doll in Master Julian's nursery, one must travel away from the velvet silence of the north wing and into the crowded, narrow veins of the city. In the mid-19th century, London was a place of extreme contrasts, where the pursuit of scientific progress often collided with the superstitions of the past. The men who would become the midnight taxidermists began their careers in the bright, clinical halls of Guy's Hospital and the Royal College of Surgeons. These were the masters of wax, individuals who could replicate the human heart, the nervous system, and the subtle textures of muscle with such frightening accuracy that they were hailed as the heroes of medical education. Among these men, none was more skilled or more mysterious than a former assistant to the great Joseph Towne. Joseph Towne was the most celebrated anatomical wax modeler of the Victorian era, a man who produced over 1,000 models for Guy's Hospital during his 50-year tenure. His secret was a proprietary blend of beeswax, resin, and pigments that mimicked the translucency of human skin better than any other material on Earth. But while Towne worked for the advancement of science, his assistant, a man known in the underworld only as Silas Thorne, saw a more lucrative path. Thorne realized that the same techniques used to teach students about the mortality of the body could be used to deceive the world about the arrival of death. By the early 1870s, Silas Thorne had established an underground workshop in the cellar of an abandoned apothecary shop near the old meat markets of Smithfield. The air in this neighborhood was always thick with the iron smell of blood and the pungent aroma of rendered fat, making it the perfect cover for a trade that dealt in the chemical preservation of the human form. To enter Thorne's workshop was to step into a cathedral of the uncanny. The walls were lined with wooden crates filled with bleached beeswax, jars of arsenic, and rows of glass eyes that seemed to track the movement of every visitor. Thorne did not advertise his services in the newspapers. He did not need to. In the high society of London, secrets traveled through the backstairs, whispered from butler to solicitor, and from solicitor to the desperate patriarchs of failing dynasties. When a child died before a crucial inheritance could be secured, Silas Thorne was the man who was summoned in the middle of the night. He would arrive at the back door of a mansion, his medical bag filled with the tools of a surgeon, but the intent of a ghost, ready to take the measurements that would allow him to build a replacement. The process began with the collection of biological materials, a gruesome necessity that the clients preferred to ignore. Thorne required the actual hair of the deceased to ensure a perfect match in color and texture. He would often remove the primary teeth, which were then set into the wax gums of the doll to provide a natural shine when the lips were parted in a simulated smile. This was the dark reality of the trade. A literal harvesting of the dead to create an effigy that could withstand the scrutiny of a monthly visit from an aging accountant. Inside the flickering amber light of the Smithfield workshop, the air grew colder as Thorne began the primary assembly of the effigy. The centerpiece of the room was a long table of scarred mahogany, covered in a fine dusting of white powder. This was not common chalk, but a mixture of crushed bone and refined spermaceti, a waxy substance harvested from the head of a sperm whale. Historically, in the late 19th century, spermaceti was prized by high-end candle makers and artisans for its ability to stay firm in heat while maintaining a ghostly, translucent sheen. Thorne blended this with virgin beeswax and a drop of damar resin, a substance sourced from the dipterocarp trees of Southeast Asia. This resin, which became a staple in European varnishes after the 1860s, gave the wax the necessary structural integrity to hold a likeness for decades without melting or cracking in the variable temperatures of an English manor. The layering process was a slow, hypnotic ritual. Thorne would pour the molten wax into a plaster mold taken from the deceased child's face, a process that required a steady hand and a heart of stone. As the wax cooled, he would begin the delicate task of tinting. He did not use standard oil paints, which sat on the surface like a mask. Instead, he used a technique learned from the great masters of the Renaissance, layering translucent glazes of carmine and ochre within the wax itself. This created the illusion of depth, as if the blood were still flowing just beneath the surface of the cheek. Every vein was painted with a single hairbrush, a web of blue and violet that only became visible when a candle was held at a specific angle. The most unsettling part of the construction was the insertion of the hair. Each strand was taken from the bundle, harvested at the house, and pushed into the warm wax with a heated needle, one by one. It was a task that could take weeks of silent labor. As he worked, Thorne would often listen to the rhythmic scratching of the needle, a sound that filled the empty spaces of the cellar. He knew that the hair carried the scent of the child, a scent that would eventually be replaced by the sterile aroma of the workshop. To the grieving mothers who would eventually receive these dolls, the hair was the only part of their child that remained real, a physical connection to a life that had been snatched away. This obsession with the tactile relics of the dead was a defining characteristic of Victorian mourning culture, where locks of hair were woven into intricate jewelry and encased in gold lockets. But in Thorne's workshop, the hair was not a memento. It was a component in a grand deception. The moral decay of this process was not lost on the artisans. They were men who had been trained to respect the sanctity of the human form, yet they found themselves treating it as a raw material for a financial transaction. They were the architects of a culture that valued the continuity of wealth over the honesty of grief. In 1875, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act had just been passed in London to prevent the adulteration of common goods. Yet there was no law to prevent the adulteration of the human experience. The elite were willing to buy a counterfeit life to protect their status, and Thorne was more than willing to sell it to them. He viewed his work as a form of mercy, a way to bridge the gap between a devastating loss and a crushing legal reality. But as the effigy of Master Julian began to take shape, Thorne encountered a problem that his wax and resin could not solve. He noticed a small, irregular tremor in the wax of the left hand, a vibration that seemed to come from within the table itself. He checked the floor for passing carriages and looked for the scurrying of rats, but the workshop was silent. The tremor remained, a rhythmic pulsing that felt like a distant, underground heartbeat. He began to wonder if some part of the child's essence had followed the hair and the teeth into the cellar. It was a question that kept him awake during the long, damp hours of the London night. If the doll was a perfect vessel, what was to stop something else from stepping inside to occupy it? Silas Thorne was not a master of movement, only of the surface. To breathe life into the paraffin husk of Master Julian, he required a collaborator from the darker corners of Clerkenwell, the watchmaking heart of the city. In the late 19th century, Clerkenwell was a hive of specialized labor, where independent masters produced the escapements and hairsprings that powered the British Empire's obsession with time. In 1876, the world was marveling at the rise of the autonomous machine. Yet in Thorne's cellar, this technology was turned toward a more intimate deception. He summoned a man named Elias Vane, a clockmaker who had been expelled from the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers for attempting to create a machine that could mimic a human pulse. Vane arrived with a leather satchel full of brass cogs and miniature bellows made from the skin of an unborn calf, a material so fine it could hold air without the slightest leak. Together, they hollowed out the chest cavity of the wax child, carving into the hardened spermaceti to create a space for the mechanical heart. The assembly was a study in grotesque precision. Vane installed a series of eccentric cams that converted the steady rotation of a mainspring into the erratic, natural-looking rise and fall of the chest. It was designed to run for 12 hours on a single winding, a duration specifically chosen to allow the nursery to remain undisturbed through the night. The sound of the machine was the greatest challenge. A clock's tick was too sharp, too rhythmic. Vane used felt-covered gears and oil-bathed bearings to soften the sound into a wet, rhythmic sigh that perfectly imitated the labor of a sickly child. This was the pinnacle of the Victorian era's moral decay, where the ingenuity meant for the clocks of the Admiralty was repurposed to sustain a legal lie. The artisans were no longer creating a doll. They were constructing a monument to the family's refusal to yield their status to the natural law of decay. Every 500 words of the story, Thorne would pause and consult his sketches, ensuring that the tilt of the head and the curve of the fingers matched the photographs provided by the family. In 1876, photography was still a ritual of the wealthy, often used to capture the likeness of the deceased in post-mortem portraits. These images served as the blueprint for Thorne's work. He used a magnifying glass to count the pores in the skin of the boy's image, replicating them with a heated needle. As he worked, the rhythmic pulse from the table grew stronger, syncing with Vane's mechanical bellows. The two men stood in the candlelight, watching the wax chest begin its first artificial breath. It was a moment of profound success and terrifying implications. They had created a body that would never rot, powered by a heart that would never tire. But the air in the cellar had grown heavy, as if the room itself was struggling to breathe alongside the machine. Vane whispered that the doll felt heavier than it should, as if the wax was absorbing more than just the light of their candles. The psychological toll began to manifest in Thorne's dreams. He began to see the doll not as an object, but as a silent tenant of his mind. He questioned the nature of the moral decay he was facilitating. In a society that prided itself on Christian virtue and the dignity of the soul, he was helping the most powerful families in the realm to worship a golden calf made of paraffin. The elite did not want a child to love. They wanted a legal entity to hold a title. The doll was a placeholder for a fortune, a silent witness to the cold calculation of the British inheritance system. If the child's death was acknowledged, the house would be sold and the servants dismissed. By purchasing the doll, the family bought the right to remain in their world of velvet and gold, but at the cost of their very humanity. Thorne looked at the glass eyes of the Julian effigy and realized that he was no longer just a taxidermist. He was a priest of a secret religion, one where the only god was the preservation of a bloodline that had already turned to dust as the construction reached its final stage. The artisans began the dressing of the effigy. This was perhaps the most ghoulish part of the process. The family had sent the original Julian's favorite velvet suit, a garment that still held the faint, lingering scent of the nursery. Thorne dressed the wax figure with a tenderness that felt like a mockery. He adjusted the lace collar and polished the small leather shoes. He felt as if he were preparing a body for a funeral that would never happen. The clothes fit the doll perfectly, a physical confirmation that the living child had been replaced by a static memory. Vane watched from the shadows, his hands trembling as he wound the mainspring for the final test. The machine began to click. The chest began to rise. The living Mourning Doll was complete, but as they stood back to admire their work, a strange sound emerged from the doll's mouth. It was not the sigh of the bellows or the click of the gears. It was a soft, wet gurgle, like a child clearing its throat. Thorne and Vane froze. There was no mechanism for speech, no gear for sound. The wax lips remained closed, but the gurgle continued, growing louder and more rhythmic. It was as if the biological components, the hair and the teeth, were attempting to speak through the wax. Thorne reached out a hand to touch the doll's throat, and for a split second he felt a warmth that should not have been there. It was a heat that bypassed the paraffin and touched his very soul. He realized then that they had built more than a machine. They had built a doorway. The warmth beneath Thorne's hand was a fleeting, terrifying sensation, a phantom spark that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the sterile smell of wax and the cold reality of his craft. He pulled his fingers away, his skin tingling as if he had touched a low electric current. Elias Vane, usually so steady with his watchmaking tools, had retreated to the furthest corner of the cellar, his face illuminated by a single guttering candle. He whispered that the machine was behaving exactly as designed, yet the sound was wrong. It was a gurgle that bypassed the laws of physics, a vibration that felt as though it originated in the very air surrounding the waxen shell. This was the true horror of the forbiddance industry, not just the manipulation of the dead, but the invitation of something entirely unknown to occupy the void left by the deceased. The midnight taxidermists were masters of the shell, but they had no control over what the silence of the shell might attract. In the year 1878, the London streets were gripped by the terror of the baby farming scandals, most notably the trial and execution of Amelia Dyer. This was a dark era where the lives of the most vulnerable were treated as disposable commodities, a grim historical mirror to the work being done in Thorne's workshop. While the poor were being neglected for profit, the rich were paying to have the image of their children preserved in a perverse, mechanical immortality. The moral decay had reached its apex. The value of a child was no longer found in their laughter or their growth, but in their ability to serve as a legal vessel for an inheritance. Silas Thorne stood over the Julian effigy and realized that he was the high priest of this new, hollow religion. He was the one who provided the saints for the cathedrals of the greedy. Every time he pushed a needle into the wax, he was stitching another layer into a shroud of lies that covered the entire city, The final delivery was scheduled for the darkest hour before dawn, a time when the fog was so thick that the buildings of Smithfield seemed to dissolve into the gray air. A nondescript black carriage, its wheels muffled by thick layers of leather and felt, arrived at the back entrance of the apothecary shop. The effigy was placed into a custom-built wooden crate, lined with the same blue velvet that adorned the nursery at Blackwood Manor. Thorne packed the edges with sawdust and shredded wool, his movements hurried and frantic. He wanted the object out of his cellar. He wanted the eyes to stop watching him. As he nailed the lid shut, the sound of the hammer on wood echoed like a series of gunshots in the quiet alleyway. He felt a strange reluctance, a feeling that he was not just shipping an object, but a living secret that would eventually consume the house. He watched the carriage pull away, its lanterns flickering like dying stars in the thick London fog. The transaction was complete. The gold was in his pocket, but the silence of the cellar now felt heavy with a presence that had not been there before. The transition of the doll from the workshop to the nursery was the final act of the conspiracy. It was moved through the servant passages of Blackwood Manor, carried by men who were sworn to secrecy by the threat of the workhouse or the gallows. They moved like ghosts through the guts of the house, bypassing the sleeping servants and the locked doors of the drawing rooms. When they reached the north wing, the crate was opened with a crowbar, the screech of metal on wood sounding like a cry of pain in the still air. Lady Catherine was waiting. She did not scream when she saw the finished piece under the dim light of the nursery candelabras. She did not weep. She simply reached out and stroked the wax cheek, a look of profound, terrifying relief washing over her face. She saw exactly what she wanted to see, a son who would never grow, never change, and most importantly, never die. The mechanical hiss of the lungs was a symphony to her ears, the sound of a fortune secured, but as the governess, Elspeth Thorne, would soon discover, the mother's relief was the first step into a deeper kind of madness. The nursery was no longer a room for a child. It was a chamber of psychological collapse where the line between the living and the inanimate was about to dissolve entirely. The heartbeat you hear is not mechanical, and the breathing you feel is not coming from the machine. Is the warmth in the wax a trick of the mind, or is the doll slowly beginning to generate its own heat? The answers are not found in the gears or the beeswax, but in the fragile mind of a woman who has chosen to believe a lie over the truth of her own grief. If the mother is under a trance who is truly the master of the house, the answer lies in the psychological collapse of a mind that has forgotten the difference between a memory and a machine, the most profound betrayal of the human. Mind is not found in the madness of the streets, but in the quiet, candlelit nurseries of the elite, where a mother's grief is transformed into a forbidden trance. Within the walls of Blackwood Manor, the natural order has been severed, replaced by a lie so powerful it has consumed the sanity of everyone who breathes its air. You see a woman cradling her child, but the child is a hollow effigy of beeswax and clockwork, a cold machine that she treats with more tenderness than a living soul. This is the secret curse of the Mourning Doll, a psychological collapse that forces the servants to participate in a grotesque pantomime, spoon-feeding warm milk into a mouth that cannot swallow and changing the silk linens of a bed that never feels a heartbeat. It is a world of moral decay where the boundary between the living and the inanimate has dissolved, leaving behind a house of ghosts who are still walking. The mother has entered a state of cognitive dissonance so deep that she no longer recognizes the scent of arsenic and turpentine, smelling only the phantom fragrance of her lost son. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the flickering shadows on the heavy damask wallpaper, the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seems to count the heartbeats of the house. The world outside is a distant memory, a place of sun and wind that cannot penetrate the thick velvet curtains of the north wing. Breathe deeply and let the stillness of the manor settle into your bones as we explore the deepening fog of the mother's mind. To walk the hallways of Blackwood Manor in the winter of 1874 was to walk through a waking dream. For the servants, the arrival of the Mourning Doll was not a relief, but the beginning of a long psychological erosion. Every morning, the head maid, a woman named Martha, who had served the family for 30 years, was required to enter the nursery with a tray of warm milk and soft bread. She had to perform the ritual of the morning meal, standing by the cradle as Lady Catherine spoke to the waxen figure in soft, cooing tones. Martha would have to hold the silver spoon to the painted lips, allowing a few drops of milk to spill onto a lace bib, which she would then carefully wipe away. The milk was never consumed. It was simply poured into a hidden basin beneath the floorboards later that day. A waste of nourishment in a city where thousands were starving. This ritual was a requirement of the household's new reality. Lady Catherine had convinced herself that the child was simply in a state of extreme lethargy, a malady that required constant, gentle care. In the history of Victorian mourning, this period was defined by the strict etiquette of the black-bordered letter and the regulation of grief. By 1875, the industry of mourning stationery had reached its peak, with specific widths of black borders indicating the degree of loss and the time passed since the death. But Lady Catherine had bypassed these rules entirely. She used no black borders. She sent no announcements of passing. To her, the Mourning Doll was not a memorial, it was the reality. She had fallen into what the alienists of the time were beginning to call a monomania, a singular obsession that blinded her to every other truth. The servants moved through the house like shadows, their eyes always averted from the nursery door. They were trapped in a collective psychosis, forced to maintain the illusion for the sake of their positions. If a neighbor visited, they had to speak of Master Julian's improving health. If a solicitor called, they had to ensure the mechanical lungs were wound to their highest tension. The psychological pressure was immense. They began to experience the phenomenon of the uncanny valley, a term we use today to describe the revulsion felt when an artificial object looks almost, but not quite human. To the maids, the doll's glass eyes seemed to hold a malignant intelligence. They swore that the eyes followed them as they dusted the shelves, tracking their movements with a frozen, crystalline stare that never blinked. As the weeks bled into months, the ritual of the nursery became more elaborate, a complex dance of maintenance that required the physical manipulation of the heir's cold, unyielding body. Every afternoon, under the watchful and glazed eyes of Lady Catherine, 2 laundry maids were summoned to change Master Julian's attire. This was not a simple task of dressing a child. The wax effigy, reinforced with internal metal supports and the heavy clockwork mechanism, weighed as much as a fully grown hound. The maids had to lift the stiff, heavy limbs with practiced care, their fingers often slipping on the smooth, cool surface of the paraffin. They described the sensation as lifting a corpse that had been frozen in mid-air, a body that possessed all the weight of humanity, but none of the yielding softness of life. The historical context of the 1870s provides a window into why such a delusion could flourish. This was an era where the medicalization of grief was beginning to take hold in the great urban centers of Europe. In 1876, the famed neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot was conducting his public lessons on hysteria at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. His work, which explored the profound physical manifestations of psychological trauma, was widely discussed in the salons of London. Lady Catherine's condition would likely have been categorized by the alienists of the day as a form of hysterical blindness, a protective mechanism of the mind that allowed her to project her memories onto the doll with such intensity that her optic nerves simply refused to report the truth. To her, the wax was not wax. It was the soft, breathing skin of her son. The mechanical hiss of the bellows was not a gear. It was the sound of a struggle against a winter fever. For the servants, however, the medical labels offered no comfort. They were the ones who had to handle the doll in the dim light of the evening, when the shadows in the nursery seemed to stretch and twist like reaching fingers. The psychological phenomenon of the uncanny valley became their daily reality. This is the instinctive revulsion humans feel when an object looks too much like a person, but lacks the micro-expressions and warmth that signal life. The maids began to whisper about the doll's glass eyes. These eyes, sourced from the finest optical workshops in Clerkenwell, were crafted with a slight curve to capture and refract the candlelight. In the flickering gloom, this refraction created the illusion of a following gaze. To a tired servant, it felt as though the doll was judging their every movement, its silent, crystalline eyes burning with a secret, ancient malice. The atmosphere in the house grew heavy, as if the very air was becoming as stagnant and artificial as the nursery itself. The servants started to report strange occurrences that defied the logic of the clockwork. A housemaid, while cleaning the nursery in the early morning, claimed to have found a single, salty tear resting on the doll's waxen cheek. She had wiped it away, but her hand had trembled for hours afterward. How could a machine of beeswax and whale fat produce a tear? Was it a trick of the condensation from the damp London air? Or was the mother's intense belief beginning to manifest a physical response from the object? This soft mystery began to haunt the staff, a question that sat at the back of their minds like a cold stone. If the doll was truly a machine, why did it feel as though it were waiting for the lights to go out? The psychological tension eventually led to the first of many breakdowns among the staff. A young nursery maid, barely 16 years old, was found collapsed in the hallway outside the north wing, her eyes wide with a terror that she could not voice. When she was finally able to speak, she claimed that while she was adjusting the doll's silk pillows, the wax hand had reached out and gripped her wrist with the strength of an iron vice. The butler had dismissed her immediately, citing a fever, but the mark on her wrist was a deep, purple bruise in the shape of a small, childish hand. The moral decay of the house was no longer just a matter of inheritance. It was a physical contagion that was beginning to leave marks on the living. The psychological infection of the north wing did not stop at the nursery door. It began to bleed into the very rituals of the evening, transforming the grand dining room of Blackwood Manor into a theater of the macabre. At precisely 7 o'clock each night, the heavy silver dinner bell would chime, its sound a cold, metallic reminder of a civilization that had already collapsed within these walls. The butler and the footman were required to perform the ascension of the air. They would carry the heavy wax effigy from the nursery down the grand staircase, its articulated limbs swaying with a sickening rhythmic grace. They would place the doll in a high chair at the head of the long mahogany table, positioned directly across from Lady Catherine. For the mother, this was the highlight of her day. The moment when the mother's trance reached its most vibrant and terrifying intensity. She would dress in her finest evening gowns, her diamonds reflecting the light of 100 candles, and speak to the doll as if it were a participating member of the conversation. She would ask the wax figure about its day, about the imaginary birds it had seen from the window, and about the progress of its imaginary lessons. The servants had to stand at attention, their faces as stiff and expressionless as the object they served. They had to offer the doll the finest cuts of meat and the rarest vintages of wine, only to watch as the silver platters were returned to the kitchen untouched. This was the true moral decay of the estate, a waste of resources that served only to nourish a delusion. The servants were no longer just workers, they were the supporting cast in a play of shadows. Their own sanity, the price of their employment. In the year 1874, the field of mental health was undergoing a profound shift with the publication of Henry Maudsley's seminal work, Responsibility in Mental Disease. Maudsley, one of the most prominent alienists of the Victorian era, argued that insanity was often a hereditary physical disease of the brain, a result of the moral decay of previous generations. He described states of partial insanity where an individual could appear perfectly rational in every aspect of their life except for one specific, uncheckable delusion. Lady Catherine was the living embodiment of Maudsley's theories. To the outside world, to the solicitors and the distant cousins who occasionally visited, she was a grieving but dignified widow. But within the sanctuary of the dining room, she was a woman who had successfully severed her connection to the physical world, choosing instead to live in a reality where death could be defeated by a well-wound spring for the servants. The psychological toll manifested as a form of sensory distortion. They began to hear sounds that the mechanical bellows could not produce. The footman who stood behind the doll's chair swore he could hear a low, wet breathing coming from the wax chest, a sound that did not match the steady click of the gears. He described it as the sound of someone trying to speak through water, a desperate, muffled vibration that made the silver in his hands shake. This was the anti-drowsy hook that kept the staff in a state of constant, low-level panic. Was the doll truly just a machine, or was the intense focus of Lady Catherine's will beginning to draw something into the shell? They started to wonder if the doll was not just a placeholder for the boy, but a trap for something else, something that had been waiting in the dark corners of the manor for a vessel to inhabit. The uncanny valley now extended to the very furniture and shadows of the room. The glass eyes of the doll, reflecting the flickering candelabras, seemed to take on a life of their own. The staff felt that the doll was not just watching them, but judging them for their participation in the lie. They felt a deep, instinctive shame every time they adjusted the doll's napkin or polished its wax fingers. The house had become a prison of the mind where the bars were made of silk and the jailer was a woman who could no longer see the difference between a memory and a machine. Every night, as they carried the heir back up the stairs, the servants felt a sense of profound exhaustion, a fatigue that was not of the body, but of the soul. They were mourning a child who was not there, and serving a mistress who had already followed him into the grave. The psychological erosion reached its zenith as the winter of 1874 gave way to a particularly bleak and frostbitten spring. Inside the north wing, the mother's trance had evolved from a state of quiet delusion into a full-scale cognitive architecture that, restructured the lives of everyone within the manor. Lady Catherine began to insist that Master Julian was growing, not in the physical sense that a healthy child might, but in the psychological and social capacity. She began to order new sets of clothes in slightly larger sizes, claiming that the wax limbs felt longer and the porcelain chest broader. The servants were forced to adjust the internal metal supports of the effigy, a task that required them to reach inside the cold, hollow body and manipulate the steel joints. They described a sensation of profound resistance, as if the doll were tensing its non-existent muscles against their intrusion. This was no longer just a shared madness. It was becoming a physical reality that challenged their very perception of what was possible. In the history of psychiatric study, the year 1877 would see the formalization of this phenomenon by the French physicians Charles Lussey and Jean-Pierre Falrit. They termed it folie à deux, or communicated insanity, a condition where a person with a strong personality transmits their delusions to those around them. At Blackwood Manor, Lady Catherine was the primary source, her intense grieving while acting as a psychological tether that dragged the servants into her artificial reality. They were not merely pretending to believe her for the sake of their wages, they were beginning to doubt their own senses. When the mother whispered that the boy had smiled at her, the nursery maid found herself staring at the painted lips until they seemed to twitch. The historical anchor of this shared delusion reveals a society so terrified of social instability and the loss of status that it would rather surrender its collective sanity than face a difficult truth. The atmosphere of the nursery became increasingly saturated with the scent of the uncanny valley. The glass eyes of the doll, once mere reflections of candlelight, now seemed to possess a depth that was entirely inappropriate for an object of wax. The staff began to avoid looking directly at the effigy, claiming that to meet its gaze was to feel a cold, draining sensation in their own chests. They spoke of the doll in hushed, fearful tones, no longer calling it Master Julian, but referring to it as the tenant. They felt like intruders in a room that was slowly being claimed by an inanimate force. This led to the next soft mystery that kept the staff's minds hooked in a state of perpetual unease. During the nightly dressing ritual, a laundry maid discovered that the doll's waxen fingernails, which had always been short and neatly rounded, now appeared to be slightly longer and sharper. She tried to trim them with her sewing shears, but the wax was so hard it chipped the metal blade. How could a machine of paraffin and clockwork exhibit a sign of biological growth? This anti-drowsy hook permeated the servants' quarters, sparking late-night debates over the nature of the object in the north wing. Some argued that the chemicals Thorne had used were reacting with the damp air of the house, causing the wax to expand in irregular ways. Others, more superstitious and worn thin by the atmospheric pressure of the house, believed that the doll was literally feeding on the mother's attention, absorbing her vitality to fuel its own manifestation. The moral decay was now visible in the very fabric of the house. As the staff became increasingly erratic and prone to fits of unprovoked weeping, they were trapped in a cycle of maintenance for a master that did not exist, and their spirits were breaking under the weight of the silence. The grandest betrayal in the history of the British aristocracy did not end with a sharp gunshot or a tearful confession. It ended with the sickly sweet scent of burning honey and the sight of a human face dissolving into a puddle of golden oil. On the scorching night of July 1895, the world gathered to witness the coming of age of Julian Blackwood, the heir to a fortune that spanned continents and centuries. But as 1,000 candles in the ballroom flickered in the stagnant heat, the secret that had been buried for 2 decades began to liquefy. The forbidden truth was that the king's favorite dynasty had been ruled by a puppet of paraffin and stolen hair, a mechanical lie that was finally losing its shape. This was the reckoning of a bloodline that had valued status more than the sanctity of life. The moral decay of the family was finally visible to the naked eye as the person they called a son began to melt into the floorboards before the very eyes of the law. The solicitors held their breath, the music faltered, and the waxen mask of history began to slide away, revealing the hollow greed beneath. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Imagine the oppressive heat of a London summer, the air thick and unmoving, heavy with the weight of a storm that refuses to break. The gaslights hum with a low, hypnotic frequency, and the distant music of a string quartet drifts through the open windows of Blackwood Manor. Breathe deeply, and let the warmth of the evening wrap around you as we step into the grand ballroom, where the light is too bright and the shadows are too deep. The date was the 21st of July, 1895. A year etched into the records of the Meteorological Office for its relentless and record-breaking heat wave. For weeks, the city of London had been a furnace of brick and soot, but inside Blackwood Manor, the preparations for the heir's 21st birthday had ignored the warnings of the thermometer. The grand ballroom was a cathedral of light, decorated with thousands of imported white light that were already wilting in the sweltering air. Lady Catherine stood at the top of the staircase, her diamonds flashing like cold fire against the suffocating warmth. She had waited 20 years for this moment, the moment when the law of perpetual infancy would finally be fulfilled, and the Blackwood fortune would be legally and permanently secured in her son's name. The historical anchor of this evening was the strict requirement of the Settled Land Act and the various Victorian statutes regarding the coming of age. To inherit the vast tracts of land in the north and the commercial interests in the east, the heir was required to physically appear before the family solicitors and sign the deeds of transfer in the presence of witnesses. It was a ritual of legal theater, a moment where the biological reality of the heir was meant to be confirmed by the stroke of a pen. Mr. Abernathy, the senior partner of the firm that had managed the Blackwood affairs for generations, stood in the center of the room, his black frock coat looking absurdly heavy in the 90-degree heat. He held a silver tray with the necessary documents, his eyes scanning the crowd for the young man who had been hidden away in the north wing for his entire life. The servants moved with a frantic, desperate energy, their faces slick with sweat and fear. They knew the secret of the nursery. They knew that the heir was currently being dressed in a suit of heavy velvet and gold braid, his internal gears being wound to their highest tension. The butler, his hands trembling, had been ordered to light every single candle in the massive crystal chandeliers. There were over 3,000 of them, a sea of flame that was raising the temperature of the ballroom to a dangerous, feverish level. The heat was not just an atmospheric detail, it was a predator, a silent force that was beginning to soften the very foundations of the lie. Elspeth Thorne, still serving as the silent guardian of the secret, watched from the shadows of the gallery. She could feel the vibration of the mechanical lungs from the room above, a rhythmic click that sounded like a countdown. She wondered if the artisans who had crafted the doll had ever tested its integrity against the heat of a London summer. As the music reached a crescendo, The doors at the top of the staircase were thrown open. The crowd fell into a hushed, expectant silence. 2 footmen appeared, supporting a figure between them. It was Julian. He looked magnificent, his pale, aristocratic features caught in a beam of moonlight from the high windows. He was taller now, a masterpiece of adult waxwork that Silas Thorne had provided years ago in anticipation of this day. But as the footman began to lead him down the stairs, Elspeth noticed something that made her heart stop. A single, amber drop of liquid was trailing slowly down. Julian's temple, the descent down the grand staircase, was a study in slow-motion horror. To the guests below, blinded by the glare of thousands of candles, Julian Blackwood looked like a vision of porcelain perfection, a silent prince returning to claim his kingdom. But to the footman holding his weight, he felt terrifyingly soft. In the year 1895, the technology of high-grade paraffin was sophisticated, but it had a specific melting point, often around 120 degrees Fahrenheit. While the room was not yet that hot, the cumulative heat from the 3,000 candles in the chandeliers, combined with the lack of ventilation, had created a pocket of stagnant, baking air at the top of the ballroom. The wax was not just warming, it was beginning to lose its structural integrity from the inside out. As Julian reached the halfway point of the stairs, the amber drop on his temple was joined by another. Trailing from the corner of his jaw, Lady Catherine followed closely behind, her hand resting lightly on the velvet sleeve of her son. Her face was a mask of triumph, her eyes fixed on the solicitors waiting at the bottom. She seemed entirely oblivious to the fact that the sleeve beneath her hand was starting to feel damp. This was the pinnacle of the mother's trance, a psychological state so absolute that it could override the evidence of the physical world. Historically, such cases of mass delusion within aristocratic families were often shielded from public record by the Family Arrangements Act, which allowed the elite to settle disputes and hide scandals behind closed doors to protect the dignity of the peerage. But tonight, the stage was too large, and the audience was too vast for the curtain to remain closed. Mr. Abernathy, the solicitor, stepped forward as the heir reached the final step. He held out the fountain pen, a recent invention that was becoming the standard for legal signatures in the late 19th century. He spoke in a voice that was dry and professional, reciting the formal declaration of the transfer of the Blackwood estates. He asked Julian to confirm his identity and his willingness to accept the responsibilities of the lineage. The room fell into a silence so deep that the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the lungs within the doll's chest, click, hiss, in the intense heat. The sound seemed to have changed, becoming heavier and more labored, as if the clockwork gears were struggling to move through the softening wax. It was at this moment that the first anti-drowsy hook manifested, a question that the heat was about to force into the light. As the solicitor moved closer to the doll to offer the pen, he paused, his brow furrowing in confusion. He did not look at the melting skin, but at the doll's mouth. He leaned in, his ear inches from the wax lips, and heard a sound that was not the click of a gear. It was a faint human whisper, a single word repeated over and over in a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering across stone. It was not a recording, for such technology was still in its infancy with the phonograph. And it was certainly not the mechanical bellows. Who or what was speaking from the center of the melting effigy? The heat in the ballroom continued to rise, the lila now turning brown and curling into themselves. The amber liquid was no longer just a few drops, it was a steady stream. The left side of Julian's face began to sag. the perfectly sculpted cheekbone losing its definition and sliding toward the chin. The glass eye, no longer supported by the hardened paraffin, tilted slightly upward, giving the air a look of divine madness. The guests began to whisper, a low hum of realization spreading through the room like a physical chill despite the sweltering air. They saw the golden oil dripping onto the white lace of the collar. They saw the velvet of the suit becoming saturated in dark. Lady Catherine did not flinch. She simply reached out with a lace handkerchief and wiped the liquid from Julian's face, her movements gentle and rhythmic. She told the solicitor that the heat was simply causing the boy to perspire, a sign of his vigorous health and the excitement of the evening. She urged him to continue with the signing. But Mr. Abernethy was no longer looking at the papers. He was staring at the hand that Julian was meant to use for the signature. The wax fingers, once elegant and long, were now beginning to fuse together, the heat turning the hand into a featureless golden mitten. The secret that had been guarded for 20 years was no longer a matter of words or documents. It was a physical dissolution that no amount of diamonds or lila could hide. The solicitor, his own hand shaking with a mixture of professional duty and visceral dread, reached out to guide the heir's fingers toward the parchment. As his skin made contact with the wax, he did not find the resistance of bone or the warmth of a living hand. Instead, his fingers sank into the palm of Julian Blackwood as if it were soft, warm dough. A sickening, oily liquid seeped out from the contact point, staining the white cuff of the solicitor's shirt with a translucent, yellowish grease. Mr. Abernethy pulled back, a look of pure, unadulterated shock breaking through his decades of legal stoicism. The hand of the heir did not return to its original shape. It remained deformed, a grotesque, melted claw that hung limply at the end of a velvet sleeve. The historical anchor of this moment is found in the extreme conditions of the 1895 heat wave, which reached its zenith in late July, while the official records of the Greenwich Observatory noted a temperature of 86 degrees in the shade. The interior of a ballroom filled with thousands of wax candles and hundreds of batas would have easily exceeded 110 degrees. In such an environment, the structural integrity of even the finest Parisian wax models began to fail. This was not just a failure of art, but a failure of a legal system that relied on the physical presence of a person to validate a fortune. The Victorian legal framework was a rigid structure of seals and signatures, yet it was being undone by the simple, ancient physics of heat and tallow. Lady Catherine moved forward then, her eyes shining with a frantic silver light. She did not look at the solicitor, nor did she look at the guests who were now backing away toward the edges of the ballroom. She looked only at the sagging, golden face of her son. She produced a silk fan and began to move the air around the doll with a desperate, fluttering motion. She whispered that the air was too heavy, that the child needed more space to breathe. But as she fanned the figure, the movement only served to accelerate the dissolution. The heat from the candles was being trapped within the velvet suit, turning the internal clockwork into a slow-burning furnace. It was then that the next anti-drowsy hook emerged, a sight that turned the stomach of every witness in the room. As the skin on Julian's chest softened and began to slide downward, a small brass door in the effigy's torso became visible through the gaps in the shifting wax. This door, which Elspeth Thorne had seen in the nursery years ago, was now warped by the heat. It groaned, the metal expanding and straining against the internal springs. Suddenly the latch snapped. The panel did not just open, it fell away, and from the hollow center of the air, a stream of dark, Viscous fluid began to pour onto the polished floor. It was not wax. It was a thick, dark substance that carried the unmistakable metallic scent of blood and the sharp, acidic tang of decay. The question that had haunted the staff for 20 years was finally being answered in the most horrific way possible. If the doll was a machine, why was it filled with the biological remains of the living? The soft mystery of the whisper heard in the previous hour now took on a terrifying new dimension. The guests watched in frozen silence as the dark fluid pooled around the silver shoes of the doll. Was this the lifeblood of the source children who had been hidden in the walls? Or was it something older, a hidden ritual used by the midnight taxidermist to bind the machine to the lineage? The moral decay was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical overflow that was ruining the expensive rugs and staining the history of the house. Mr. Abernethy dropped the silver tray. The deeds of the Blackwood estate fell into the dark puddle, the ink of the signatures beginning to run and blur as they absorbed the fluid. The legal transfer was being drowned in the very lie that had sustained it. Lady Catherine fell to her knees, her expensive silk skirts soaking up the golden wax and the dark blood. She reached out to catch the features of her son as they slid away, her fingers moving frantically to push the wax back into the shape of a nose, a mouth, a chin. But the more she touched it, the more it dissolved. The glass eyes, now completely unsupported, fell from the face and shattered on the floor like two small crystal bells. The psychological layer of the room had shifted from a shared delusion into a collective trauma. The mother's trance had broken, not into a realization of the truth, but into a total collapse of the surrounding reality. The guests began to flee, their silk dresses and leather boots slipping on the oily floor. They ran from the smell of the burning honey and the rot, leaving the mother alone in the center of the ballroom with her melting god. The string quartet had stopped playing. The only sound remaining was the rhythmic, dying click of the gears within the doll, a sound that was becoming slower and slower as the fluid gummed up the works, the sound of the final gear snapping inside. Julian's chest was like the crack of a winter branch, a sharp final punctuation to 2 decades of deception. As the mainspring uncoiled in a frantic, tangled mess of brass ribbon, the rhythmic wheezing stopped forever. The ballroom was now silent, save for the heavy, wet sound of wax hitting the floor and the distant, low rumble of the storm that had finally begun to break over London. The heat had won. The heir to the Blackwood fortune was no longer a person or even a puppet. He was a shapeless mound of golden sludge draped in the ruins of a velvet suit. The brass skeleton of the internal mechanism was now visible, standing like a cage of bone amidst the melting flesh. This was the inheritance reckoning, a moment where the weight of the lie became too heavy for the physical world to support. The bankruptcy of the Blackwood estate was not just financial, it was a total insolvency of the spirit. Historically, the year 1895 marked a turning point in the regulation of British estates with the introduction of the Finance Act of 1894, which established the modern system of estate duty. This law made it increasingly difficult for families to hide the transition of wealth, requiring a level of transparency and documentation that the Blackwoods had spent 20 years avoiding. The scene in the ballroom was the ultimate failure of their strategy. Mr. Abernethy, standing amidst the ruined documents and the spreading oil, knew that the game was over. He looked at Lady Catherine, who was still cradling the headless, armless torso of the doll, and he saw the absolute end of a dynasty. There would be no more appeals, no more secret workshops, and no more bribes. The law would finally step into the North Wing. and it would find nothing but shadows and the hollow shells of a stolen history, the final anti-drowsy hook. The question of the whisper and the dark fluid reached its chilling conclusion as the last of the wax slid away from the base of the effigy. Within the hollow center of the brass rib cage, resting where a human heart should have been, was a small leaden box. It was the source of the metallic scent and the rhythmic vibration. Elspeth Thorne, watching from the gallery, realized that the midnight taxidermists had not just used the hair and teeth of the living. They had preserved the very organs of the original Julian in a bath of formaldehyde and arsenic to ensure the presence of the heir. The machine was a reliquary, a mechanical tomb that had been forced to mimic life for 20 years. The whisper was the sound of the chemical vapors escaping the leaden box as the seals failed in the heat. It was a truth so dark that the solicitors chose to burn the nursery rather than report it. To the authorities, Lady Catherine did not move when the servants finally approached to lead her away. She remained on the floor, her fingers tracing patterns in the cooling wax. She did not see the solicitors leaving or the guests fleeing into the rain. She had retreated into the final, deepest layer of the trance. In her mind, the ball was still continuing, the music was still playing, and Julian was still the perfect silent boy she had loved. She chose to melt into the lie, her sanity dissolving along with the paraffin features of her son. The family did not face the bankruptcy of the truth. They simply ceased to exist as rational beings, becoming part of the folklore of the London fog. The manor would eventually be sold, the velvet would rot, and the brass gears would be sold for scrap. But the scent of the burning honey would linger in the hallways for a century. The storm outside is now in full force, the rain washing away the soot of the city and cooling the parched earth. The lights in the ballroom are going out, one by one, as the candles finally burn down to their silver sockets. The story of the Mourning Doll is ending, but the shadows it left behind are still moving in the corner of your vision. You are safe now, tucked away from the heat and the lies of the past. But the rhythmic clicking of the clock in your room sounds just a little too much like a mechanical lung. If the air was made of wax, what are the foundations of your own history built upon? The night is long and the secrets of the elite are many, but for now, the silence is your only companion. As the last flame flickers and dies, we must ask ourselves a final, lingering question. If the solicitors burned the records and the family dissolved into madness, who was the figure seen walking in the overgrown gardens of Blackwood Manor the following summer? A figure that looked like a young man of 21, standing perfectly still in the moonlight. The answer is not in the books, but in the enduring power of a mother's will to never let go.